Hello and welcome to the Carlton Academy's Year 10 lesson on policies towards women in Nazi Germany. Hopefully you've already completed the starter that we've done live on Teams. If you haven't, you need to go back and do that first, and then you can start on this work that we've got on this YouTube PowerPoint. So, as you already know, today we're going to look at Nazi policies towards the women. We're going to look at what it was like for them in terms of having children. We're going to look at their restrictions on their personal freedoms, and we're going to be thinking about their role with employment. So, as always, we've got our normal TCA outcomes on the slides here. Essentially, if you are describing, that's grades 3 to 4. If you're able to actually explain these policies and how they affected different women, that's grades 5 to 6. And to get a grade 7 to 9, you'd need to be able to make and justify a reasoned judgment, so basically a conclusion about how successful these policies were towards women. Okay, so we're going to start with the introduction in a second. Here are some key points that we need to know about Nazi policies towards women. Now, first of all, we need to know that the Nazi Party was a very male-dominated organisation, and they believed that men should hold all the power. Hitler had a very traditional view of the role of women and believed that women should prioritise being a wife and a mother. It's worth remembering as well that many German women actually agreed with him, especially in areas like the traditional rural towns and the countryside. Many of them felt that their role was to support their husbands. There had been some changes on the role of women in the 1920s, and there was a little bit more of an idea of women being free and being able to go out, for instance, without a chaperone. But even though there is changes going on, there were still lots of people that resisted those changes. For Hitler, as we've mentioned already, he believed that women should be a wife and a mother, but he also believed that they needed to be Aryan, so in their mind, essentially racially pure, somebody that is of Germanic origin, somebody that is genetically healthy and able to have healthy children, politically reliable, as well as being a good wife and mother. The Nazis really cared about this at this point because they were experiencing a declining birth rate and they were worried about the future of their 1,000-year Reich. So all I'd like you to do here is make a few notes using the information on this slide. The bits in red are the really key bits if you want to shorten it down. So pause it here and make a few notes. As part of your introduction, you're going to watch a couple of minutes of this documentary clip. You don't need to write anything down, but just listen to what it's saying very carefully.
Nach unabänderlichen Gesetzen. Wir gehen den Weg in eine ferne Zukunft. Und wünschen und glauben, wir möchten nicht nur sein die Enkel, die es besser ausfochten, sondern darüber hinaus die Ahnen spätester für das ewige Leben des deutschen und germanischen Volkes notwendiger Geschlechter.
SS leader Himmler asked Germans to follow Nazi genetic theories and improve the racial stock. The state gave loans to encourage healthy couples to have more children. For unusually productive mothers, there were medals. The ideal baby was racially pure and genetically fit, so partners had to be chosen with great care.
Nach unabänderlichen Gesetzen. Wir gehen den Weg in eine ferne Zukunft. Und wünschen und glauben, wir möchten nicht nur sein die Enkel, die es besser ausfochten, sondern darüber hinaus die Ahnen spätester für das ewige Leben des deutschen und germanischen Volkes notwendiger Geschlechter.
SS leader Himmler asked Germans to follow Nazi genetic theories and improve the racial stock. The state gave loans to encourage healthy couples to have more children. For unusually productive mothers, there were medals. The ideal baby was racially pure and genetically fit, so partners had to be chosen with great care.
Okay, so you've seen how they prioritised making women have lots of children, and we're going to look at that in more detail on the next slide. We're now going to look at this policy to encourage women to have more children in more detail. I'd like you to put the above as a subheading, but you don't need to write anything down on this slide, just listen as I'm talking through it. Now, we already know that the Nazis cared about the declining birth rate. They did this because they wanted lots of future soldiers for their 1,000-year Reich. They never actually put this law into action, but I'm just going to talk to you about a law that they proposed in 1943 that said that all single and married women up to the age of 35 who do not already have 4 children should be made to produce 4 children by racially pure German men. Whether these men are married is without significance. Every family that already has 4 children must set the husband free for this action. That's quite a shocking law here, suggesting that people should commit adultery in order to have lots of children. This was never actually passed, but it shows us what they think about women and their role, and that is essentially that they are breeding for the German state. Okay, so just make sure you've got that subheading, and then we're going to move on to the actual notes after. So underneath that subheading, you're going to need to make some notes. On here, we've got 4 different areas that you'll need to know about for how they encourage women to have lots of children. So first of all, in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, they passed the law for the encouragement of marriage. Now, it's already mentioned this on the documentary that there were loans for newly married couples, and these were of 1,000 marks. Now, in today's money, it's about the equivalent of 9 months' wages. So it's a lot of money here. We're talking about over £18,000 if we're talking about today's money. Now, they only got to keep all of that if they had 4 children. For every child they had, they got to keep a quarter, and therefore if they had all 4, they would keep the full amount. The second thing we need to know about is the Motherhood Cross. This was something that was awarded every year on Hitler's mother's birthday, the 12th of August, and it was a celebration event for women that had lots of children. If you had 4 children at these ceremonies, you'd be presented with a bronze medal. If you'd had 6 children, you would be presented with a silver medal. And if you had 8 children, you would earn a gold medal. Now, this made the mothers feel really valued. A lot of women had felt that their role had been overlooked in the past, and this time they felt as if they were being celebrated for doing their duty to the state. So lots of women liked this policy. For number 3, we've got here that the Nazis said that women should stick to the 3 Ks. Now, the English translation is the 3 Cs, but we need to talk about it in exams as the 3 Ks, even though the words I want you to remember are children, church, and cooking. So these are what women were supposed to prioritise in their life. The 4th thing that they did to try and encourage women to have lots of children is through the Lebensborn homes, which translates as spring of life. Now, originally, these were homes for unmarried mothers. To have a child outside of marriage was a real scandal at this point in the 1930s. And as a result, lots of women, fearing that they might be kicked out of their family homes or shamed by society, would have tried to have an abortion. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, abortions were illegal, and up to 10,000 to 12,000 women a year in Germany died from these botched abortions. So the Nazis wanted to try and encourage women to keep their children, so they had these homes for unmarried mothers where they would look after them. However, eventually these evolved, and by World War II, these essentially became brothels where an unmarried, racially pure woman could go to deliberately become pregnant by one of the racially pure SS men, and therefore would be donating a baby to the Führer. Sometimes these women wouldn't even raise their children afterwards, they'd be adopted by high-ranking Nazi officials. So these are 4 different ways, some of them quite shocking, for how they try to encourage women to have lots of children. Make sure you pause the video here and make some notes on those 4 different areas. So we've looked at the details of their policies. We now need to think about what was the response from women. And what I'd like you to do is just to listen as I talk through this, and then I want you to answer that question on your paper. So first of all, lots of women had actually liked the Nazi policies. They disliked the changes that were happening for women in Weimar Germany, and lots of women preferred the idea of a traditional role of a woman being a wife and a mother. So most women in Nazi Germany liked these policies. Some women, however, were quite negatively affected by these policies. For instance, if you were somebody that wasn't viewed as racially pure, Maybe you were someone that didn't have the distinctive Aryan look of the blonde hair and blue eyes, or you were somebody that was disabled, or you were somebody that couldn't have children. You'd have been looked down on society, and therefore you wouldn't have liked those changes. So first of all, we need to think about how it affects different women, some positively, where they feel like they're being celebrated, and some negatively, where they feel that they're being shamed for whatever reason. We also need to think about, were these policies successful? Did they encourage women to have as many children as the Nazis wanted them to? Well, in some ways, yes, it was successful because the birth rate did increase. However, it's not just necessarily down to Nazi policies, because there had been lots of improvements with the economy in the 1930s, recovery from the Great Depression, a lot more work for people, and therefore people were more willing to have children when they're more financially secure. So I'd like you to pause the video here and think about what was the response from women, think about how different women were affected, and also whether it was successful. If we were in lesson, we would have paused and checked your understanding at this point. So I've put the 5 questions that we would have asked you in lesson on this slide. You don't need to write down any of the answers because you should have already covered this in your notes, but I just want you to check your understanding. As I ask these questions out loud, if you don't feel like you could answer them, please go back and re-watch a bit of the video so that you can kind of consolidate your understanding. So first of all, you should be able to answer, what was the law for the encouragement of marriage and why was it introduced? You should also be able to talk about what was proposed in 1943, that's a certain law that they discussed, and what does it tell us even though it was never introduced. You should be also able to tell me what were the 3 things that women should stick to, what was awarded on Hitler's mother's birthday every year, and what the Lebensborn was. So remember, if there's anything that you are unsure of, please go back and redo that little bit of the lesson so that you can be more comfortable with the knowledge before we move on. If there are any questions about the stuff we've done so far, don't forget that we're on Teams now for you to be able to ask us questions in the live lesson. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to policy 2 and looking at what life was like for women and what kind of restrictions they faced. Now, what I'd like you to do is, once I've talked through this, to pause the video and write an answer to us on the Q&A box on Teams. We want to try and make these lessons as interactive as possible. So think about, what would you guess Nazi policies would be like when it comes to women working, when it comes to German women wearing makeup, when it comes to German women smoking? What do you reckon the fashion would be like for German women? What do you reckon they would want women to be like in terms of their weight? So I'd like you to have a little think about it, pause the video here, and then send some predictions to me in the Q&A box about what you think the German woman would be like in an ideal world when it comes to work, makeup, smoking, fashion, and their weight. We're going to be looking at changes for women in the 1930s and what kind of restrictions there were on what they looked like. Now, I think in order to understand this, it's really important to know about the changes that happened for women in the 1920s. And you can see what women dressed like in these pictures here. Now, obviously, this isn't the way that all women dressed, because particularly in areas like the countryside, they really held on to that idea of the traditional woman being dressed very modestly, even during the 1920s, which was the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, the Golden Age of Germany. Now, in these pictures here, we can see that women had experienced real changes in what they were allowed to wear throughout the 1920s. For the first time, we get groups like the flappers, like we can see in this first picture here, of women even wearing things that stopped above the knee, something that was seen as incredibly daring at that time. You can see women in the centre of Berlin here, walking together without any men. Remember, this would have been a real shock to people at this point because women were supposed to be escorted everywhere by a chaperone to make sure that they were behaving appropriately. Now, when we look at the 1930s, it looks like something that's much older than the 1920s, much more traditional. Nazis wanted women to look a certain way, and they wanted them to dress very modestly and basically be the antithesis of what women in the 1920s were. So we can see this really embodied in this picture, and we're about to start talking through what the main changes were like in terms of fashion for women in the 1930s. Under a new subheading of Policy 2, Restrictions on Women's Freedoms, I'd like you to make some notes. Think about whether this goes with what you had predicted on Teams when you sent me your answers. So first of all, women in Nazi Germany were not free to do as they liked. The Nazis even wanted to control the way they looked, and they wanted them to look really plain in order to celebrate Germany's peasant roots. They're very obsessed with this idea of blood and soil, which is part of their ideology that celebrates the traditional peasant farmers, and therefore they want women to look like them. They want them to make sure they're not wearing makeup, which had become even more popular in the 1920s. They wanted them to wear skirts and not trousers, which again had become more popular in the 1920s. They wanted their hair to be long, undyed, and in traditional styles of buns and plaits. They also even wanted to control them when it came to things like their weight. For instance, in the 1920s, it was very fashionable to be very thin. But they didn't like this because it wasn't good for childbearing. So they wanted women to even be a certain weight, and they obviously as well wanted to stop things like smoking because that wouldn't be very good for having lots of healthy babies. So pause the video here and make some notes on what kind of restrictions they had for women and what they looked like. So we're moving on now to the final policy about women and work in the 1930s. Now what you're going to do is listen to me as I talk through this information about women and employment, and then after I've done that, I'd like you to write a paragraph describing what work was like for women during the 1930s. Once you've done this, you'll find on the next slide that we're going to look at how it changed with the outbreak of World War II. But for now, we're just going to be thinking about the 1930s and this information on the slide here. Now, we already know from Policy 1 that it was all about women being wives and mothers, and that was supposed to be their focus and their priority. Now, particularly in the early 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression, there was this general consensus and anger towards women working because people felt that they were taking men's jobs. Women were particularly resented if they were what they called the double earners, where both the man and the woman were working. So there was this idea that was generally supported by massive sections of the population that women should have to give up their job for men. So Nazi policies were actually popular with most of the population in the early 1930s. From 1933, the year they came to power, they started sacking women from their jobs, especially jobs like doctors and being civil servants. They were the first to go. By 1935, lots of female lawyers and teachers had also been sacked, and by 1939, there was very few women left in professional jobs. Now, for some women, they liked these policies and they liked the fact they were now being supported with money to try and encourage them to have lots of children. But for women that had professional jobs, women that cared about being educated, women that had attended university, they found this really insulting and they didn't like the restriction on their freedom. Nazis generally didn't mind women having a few certain jobs, for instance being a midwife, but generally they put in place these rules that pushed women out of all different kinds of employment and education. As a result of these policies, the percentage of women working decreased. So the Nazis were quite successful in their aim in the 1930s of reducing the number of women working. Okay, so we're now going to think about what was it like for women in work during World War II. I'm going to talk you through all the information, and then once I have, I'd like you to pause the video and answer this question on your paper. Did World War II have a significant impact on women? Now, first of all, we already know that the Nazis wanted women to stick to the 3 Ks of children, church and cooking. They wanted them to just focus on being wives and mothers and having at least 4 children to try and combat the falling birth rate. But occasionally, the Nazis did have to contradict their own policies and ideas when it was necessary. For instance, after 1936, lots more working class women had to go and get jobs in industry as a result of the Nazi policy of conscription. Conscription is when you force men to join the army for small periods of time, and they'd introduced that in 1935, and that had taken away a key labour force for the Nazis, so lots of working class women had to step up and go back to work. As a result, lots of those working class women had to struggle with both family and work responsibilities. Let's think a little bit more about the result of World War II itself though. So first of all, between 1942 and 1945, the the Second World War wasn't going very well for Germany. Before that, it had been going really well, and they'd managed to invade lots of different nations successfully. They managed to defeat places like France and Belgium and the Netherlands, loads of different countries they'd been able to take over. However, in 1942, they were then also facing war against places like the Soviet Union and also America. And that meant that they were under a lot more strain. They even lost a very famous battle, the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, the Battle of Stalingrad, by February 1943. And as a result, all women between the ages of 17 and 45 had to register for war work unless they were exempt. Now, there were lots of exemptions. For instance, if you were pregnant, if you had 2 or more children, you were allowed to not register. But the idea was that all women that could register within that age range would. And then the Nazis could place you into any factory and go and ask you to work. So they did have to change their policies. They did have to adapt when absolutely necessary during the Second World War, when they had lost so many soldiers and they needed more and more men to fight. So there were some real changes to World War II, and they did go back on their ideology and their ideals because they absolutely needed to. However, they still wouldn't let women serve in the armed forces, even though there had been a chance to do so in some of the Allied countries. So overall, we need to think about what was the impact on women, talk about how they had to change their ideals during the Second World War, and think about whether women actually served in the armed forces or not. So pause it here to be able to complete that task. So we're on to the final task now, where you don't have to write anything down on your paper, but you do need to make sure that you are writing something down in the Q&A box on Teams. So I want us to think about bringing your learning from the lesson together and thinking about overall, would you say that the Nazi policies benefited the German women or not? So think about whether all women benefited from it. Think about whether they would have all dealt with the same impact on them. Think about maybe the key groups that didn't benefit or did benefit, and what you think might have been the most popular policies and maybe what might have been the least popular policies. So this is a really broad question. Did their policies benefit women? You might not address all the things that I just mentioned, but I do want you to make sure that you're thinking in depth about this and writing a little paragraph at least to your teacher on Teams. So pause that video here to write down your paragraph and send it to us on Teams. It's really important that you do this because we need to check your understanding from the learning.